Alrighty, well, good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. If you're watching this on recording, thanks for tuning in. My name is Allan Hirt. I'm actually not a cluster MVP. That's sort of an old thing. Got to change the bio there a little bit. So my official designation, I am actually a dual MVP. Cloud and Data Center Management, which the subcategory is high availability, formerly known as Cluster MVP, and more recently, I was also given the honor of being the dual MVP of Data Platform, in other words, a SQL Server. So I'm both a high availability and a SQL Server MVP for Microsoft. So comes with it. Now I get to bug two different dev teams, not like I don't already. But the focus of today, and why I'm going to be talking to, is some of the deployment enhancements that you can use for SQL Server 2016, and it's going to cover some SQL Server things as well as some Windows things. As John mentioned, some of these will be in my half-day session at PASS Summit in October, but not all. All of these will probably here not get a demo, whereas there most of them will, just in interest of time. Now, one of the reasons I like to do this is there are some things that you may or may not be aware of that affect your FCI and AG implementations, and I try to keep this hour specifically focused on the deployment, stuff you need to do when you're creating your FCI or your AG, not necessarily certain behavioral changes that you could change later. So I'm going to keep this a pretty focused talk on what's new. It's not your standard what's new. So we're going to talk about what's changed in SQL Server 2016 setup, some new stuff for AGs, and then some stuff that will affect FCI deployments at the Windows layer. So the first thing that I want to mention here, because it's slightly different in the way you need to handle it for FCIs or clustered instances of SQL Server, is the fact that it's a generally known best practice, and most people do it, not everyone, that if you want to use instant file initialization, meaning your data files can basically be created with not a lot of I/O contention, you give it the perform volume maintenance tasks in Windows to your service account. Built into SQL Server 2016 setup, you can now do that. It's on the server configuration service accounts tab of the server configuration. You'll see that little checkbox there, but the difference for a clustered instance is the fact that you will have to specify this for both the first node or the main install, as well as the add node, which is when you join the other nodes to that particular instance. Now, if you're doing it through the command line, there's a parameter for you, SQL SVC instant file init, and that's a true or false. You set, if you want to turn it on, SQL SVC instant file init equals true, and you'd be all set. Another actually really huge change, while not specific other than from a FCI perspective, that you would need to make sure it's on one of the cluster drives, or if you're, say, doing it local C drive, which is supported by FCI from SQL Server 2012 on. But either way, one of the biggest things that we all had to do after configuring an instance of SQL Server, be it standalone or clustered, was that many of us added to the number of data files that we could use with TempDB. Well, with SQL Server 2016, we have the ability to do that out of the box as part of setup. Either, again, you see all the parameters there, or you can do it via the GUI if you're using the SQL Server setup interface. You can say how big you want to make it initially, your autogrowth size. Now, there you'll also notice, by the way, it's autogrowth in megabytes, not percentages. So it's one of those things where if you want to do it by percentage, you'll have to go in and modify that later. But minor in the grand scheme of things. Now, there are two other things that you should be aware of with regards to TempDB. Most folks also enable trace flags 1117 and 1118. In SQL Server 2016, those behaviors are essentially on by default because they've moved that functionality to equivalent altered database T-SQL functions. But for 10TB, they're essentially already on. So there's nothing you have to do. And the biggest one there, from my perspective, is if you're going to have multiple files, that all the files grow at the same rate at the same time. That's 1117. So these are all great enhancements to SQL Server setup. There's also one that, in my opinion, could be a little contentious for some. But prior to SQL Server 2016, when you got the licensing screen, basically you could opt in to sending Microsoft some data. In SQL Server 2016, we don't no longer get that checkbox. You have to accept the EULA, but there's no way to deselect the telemetry that you send back to Microsoft. So it affects an FCI really in one way, in that, as you can see there in the picture, let me just zoom in real quick. It creates now an additional resource. It's just a generic service, but it's now something else in the role or the resource group with your SQL Server stuff. So just something to be aware of. Now, having said that, they did configure it properly in the sense that if you look at the the properties of that particular resource, if it fails for whatever reason, it's not going to cause the entire role, meaning your SQL Server clustered instance, to fail over. So that's good. You don't have to modify anything in there. However, now that means you're going to have somebody, you're going to check to make sure that somebody else doesn't modify that property. There is a supported way to disable telemetry, and that's that KD article. I want to make you aware of that. I haven't tested yet. In theory, you could just delete that little resource, but follow Microsoft support here or talk with your Microsoft support professional, because FCIs are different in this case in the standalone just because we have that additional resource in the role with your FCI. So I just wanted to point that out. It's not apparent. And by the way, this is a change that came in after RC3. This basically came in for RTM. As somebody who was in the TAP program, none of this was in any of the TAP builds, or at least RC1 and RC2. I don't remember it being in RC3. To me, this is very similar to the change they made with the domain groups thing. They snuck in at the very end of SQL Server 2005 clustered instances that eventually went away. So I'm hoping that in a future version, we have the ability to opt out as part of setup, but unfortunately we don't. Another really big change, although it's not part of setup proper, it's part of essentially our setup process, although you could change this later, is that officially with SQL Server 2016, we can use group managed service accounts and specifically use them with clustered instances of SQL Server. A GMSA is basically a service account that you create in Active Directory. So this wouldn't be something if you're not using domains, but if you're using Active Directory and you're at a minimum of a Windows Server 2012 forest functional level, you can create a managed service account in Active Directory that will take care of all the passwords and things like that, so that when you use it with SQL Server, you don't have to say if you have to change the password, or yourself, in this case, if you were managing it on your own, basically power down SQL Server and all that other stuff. It handles all that stuff on the back end. Now, you'll notice there I have a little screenshot of my FCI or an FCI created properties for the service account. You'll notice that in this case, and let me zoom in here real quick, my service account is called SQL 2016 SVC, and you'll see there's a $sign at the end. That $sign is basically what lets me know when I implement this, it's a group managed service account. Now, if you look in Active Directory, and due to time, I'm probably not going to be able to show this to you. If I do, it would be later in the talk. Is that you don't see that $sign, but when you implement it, you have that $sign. There's a couple things you need to get this working. That link that I put there should hopefully help you if this is something you want to do. Now, as a SQL Server person or DBA, you may not be very excited about this, but I can tell you your security folks and your infrastructure folks and your Windows folks have probably wanted to do this for a while. Now, some may have tried to get this to work in previous versions of SQL Server, and it may or may not have worked, but it's only officially supported starting with SQL Server 2016. All right, so what about AGs? For me, one of the biggest complaints I've heard from my customers going back to the release of SQL Server 2012 is the fact that it doesn't support DTC. To a degree, this always surprised me because the way availability groups didn't support DTC was exactly the same as how database mirroring, replication, and log shipping didn't support DTC. In other words, all the database or data in the case of replication, availability or protection features didn't support DTC at all. I think people thought that with availability groups, because I could have more than one database in an availability group, that it supported it. It doesn't. However, starting with SQL Server 2016, we now have, at least as of RTM, what I will call partial DTC support. Now, what that means is that if your database that is participating in the distributed transaction is outside of the availability group, then you should be fine. If it's inside the same availability group, that functionality is not there as of RTM. Microsoft has said they're going to get to that eventually after RTM, so there's no time frame, so I would look at upcoming service paths or CUs for that, but we do have partial DTC support. It is a T-SQL only option at creation time, which is why I'm putting it in this talk specifically. So if you remember, if you played with any of the CTP releases or the RCs, you may have noticed that at one point it was actually a checkbox in the GUI on the wizard. They took that away. So it's T-SQL only. So if you want to have availability groups use DTC, you have to do it at creation time, otherwise you're going to have to recreate it. The option is called DTC support. You can look that up in the syntax for alter availability group. Basically, the default is off, so it's not going to enable it. I believe the option to enable it is per_DB, so which means it will do it on a per database basis. So again, nice enhancement. We're partly the way there, so if you have databases sitting outside your availability group, you should be all set. If not, wait for what's coming down the pike. Now, another one that obviously is an instance level that I'm mentioning here is that there's new trace flag 9592, so that if you have enough CPU reserves and you're doing synchronous AGs, you can enable log stream compression. Obviously, there's some CPU overhead associated with that, which is why it's off by default from synchronous, because synchronous is generally going to be busier. What I would do in this case is if you want to get, obviously, potentially better network throughput by sending less stuff over the wire, you can test this trace flag in your test environments under load, but this is not something I would enable by default without testing it. Otherwise, you could see potentially problems on your servers. One they sort of mentioned last year at PASS Summit in 2015, but was introduced in RC1, I believe, of SQL Server 2016, was seeding. Simply put, right now, if you're creating an availability group, if you're using the wizard, you can either manually do it yourself, or you can have the wizard do the backup copy and the restore on your replica or replicas. Right now, if you have a VLDB, that's kind of a pain, especially if you're going, say, to another data center. How you initialize that could be challenging. So what they did here in SQL Server 2016 is there's a new feature called seeding. simply put, is you have your primary database, you have nothing at your secondary replica, you enable seeding, and when you join the secondary availability group to secondary replica to the availability group, excuse me, then what it will do is go, oh, I see seeding is enabled, so I'm basically going to take that and pull it across the wire as if I was sending that in real time as a backup, copy, and restore across the wire. Now, under the scenes, it's doing some fancy stuff. More information has been emerging. It appears it's using VDI under the covers. You can look at events. But bottom line here is that it's very cool. So for the most part these days, I would use this if I was using SQL Server 2016 with rare exceptions for initializing my secondary databases. It just makes life a whole lot easier. Similar to the other trace flag I just talked about, it's off by default because it obviously takes a CPU hit, but you can enable a trace flag 9567 to do log stream compression during seeding. Again, it's something I would test before I went and enabled. Now, like what I mentioned earlier with DTC, this is T-SQL only, so you can't use the PowerShell command list, nor can you use the GUI. So if you're kind of getting the hint, for me in SQL Server 2016, if I was creating availability groups, I'd basically only be using T-SQL because of these options. There's one or two more that are not part of this talk because they're not necessarily setup related. But I will be talking about them more in other venues. Now, one thing I have had a chance to do, because as a consultant, I generally don't have access to super large databases of customers unless I'm actually working with them, is that our own John Starrett did a test in his environment with a VLDB of how long it would take using seeding. So again, very interesting blog post. I suggest you take a look at it. But it wasn't really honestly that long of a time. Maybe if you have a 10 or 20 terabyte database, seeding may not be an option for you. But if you have a reasonable sized database with good I/O and a good network, seeding is something you should definitely look into. Another thing here that I want to point out that at the very end of this, I'm going to demo for you a little bit live, is availability groups in standard edition. Now, to satisfy the marketing bullet point request, the official name of this feature, which you will probably never hear me ever use, which is I know ironic given the whole my thing around active, passive, and always on, the official name here is basic availability groups. Basically, we don't call database mirroring in standard edition or enterprise edition standard or basic database mirroring. It's just database mirroring. But I assume they needed a nice bullet point feature on the marketing list, so here we are with basic availability groups. But really all it is we finally have what is essentially a database mirroring replacement in SQL Server 2016. Now, those of you that don't know, database mirroring was deprecated but not removed in SQL Server 2012. But now that we basically have an equivalent, it most likely will be removed in some future version of SQL Server. So if you're still implementing database mirroring, I wouldn't suggest you do it. And if you are currently using it, I would look at when you go to SQL Server 2016, switching from database mirroring to basic availability groups. Now, it quite literally is the same as database mirroring in the sense that you can only have a single database per availability group, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio just like you had your principal and your mirror. You have a primary replica and a secondary replica here, and that's it. However, in my opinion, despite the underlying complexity that you now have to take on with the Windows failover cluster that comes as part of an availability group, there are some improvements. First of all, because it's SQL Server 2016, they did improvements on the redo that aren't in 2014 or 2012 or back. So that's nice. In database smearing, if you're in standard, you got stuck in high safety mode with a witness. That was very restricted. We can have synchronous or asynchronous. Now, the reason I say failover is easier, so those of you that have done database smearing fairly extensively, to do a very clean failover, basically you have to, if you're doing asynchronous, you have to switch it to synchronous, let it get all caught up, get it synchronized, and then do your failover. That was the gracious way to do things. Here, you just follow the AG standard stuff. If you're asynchronous, you'll basically get a prompt that says, hey, you may have data loss. Are you okay with that? And the failover can just happen. To me, it's a much better process. While this was in debate during the TAC program, the listener is actually supported. The listener is that bit of functionality that abstracts the underlying server names, which is a huge advantage over database smearing in the sense that you don't need to know about the underlying server names participating either the principal or the mirror, nor do you have to do anything like create a DNS alias. And also, I've tested this, although I haven't seen it in any of the books online stuff. It does work with seeding. So, while you may not like the Windows failover cluster piece that comes along with an availability group in Standard Edition, the reality is, to me, there are enough improvements to really consider switching from database smearing, plus the fact that database smearing is going to go away at some point. To me, it's a fait accompli. So I wouldn't hinge my long-term future on it. The final thing, and the first thing I'm going to demo for you, is distributed availability groups. This is something that, again, I believe that Kevin Farley from Microsoft, who's one of the PMs working on the HA features, talked about last year. I'm not sure if he did or not, but if he didn't, it's something that got in RC1 or RC2. It was a very late feature into SQL Server 2016. Now, what is an availability group? It's what I like to call an AG of AGs. I was actually helping Microsoft get some of the pre-release documentation done, and I think that phrase may have actually gotten in to their Books Online article. Anyway, so simply put is, let's say you have, look at this picture here for a second. Let me zoom in real quick. So I have a single Windows cluster with 2 nodes and an AG. I've got another Windows cluster with 2 nodes and an AG. Now, prior to this, basically they were separate entities. You couldn't join them at all, right? Now, also note here that I've got Windows Server 2012 R2 as my nodes in the first cluster, and Windows Server 2016, as nodes in my second cluster. Now, what I can do is essentially create this distributed availability group, and I will make a plea now, and since this is going on YouTube, hopefully others will hear this. Do not use DAG as the abbreviation for this. It is not the official acronym, and kind of like DAC, we've got DAG already. It's the exchanged DAGs. So don't call it that. It is just a distributed availability group. Anyway, so you can create what's known as this distributed availability group that will span AG1 and AG2. Now, the reason for me this is so important, and right now it's only SQL Server 2016, it doesn't have any backwards compatibility. But assuming it's going to work the way I think it's going to work going forward, what this will allow me to do is have awesome migration scenarios. Let's say in this case, I have my original availability group that's on older hardware from Windows Server 2012 R2, but I want to stand up an entirely new 2-node implementation on Windows Server 2016, brand new hardware, SQL Server 2016. Assuming my versions of SQL Server currently, because we only have this in SQL Server 2016, are the same, I can then create this distributed availability group, and then at some point when everything's all copacetic, switch over to that second cluster where I essentially have AG2, unconfigure the distributed availability group, and now I have my new solution. So this is all, it all works. I've tested it. I've tested this 2012 R2 combination. It's not what I'm going to demo for you here today. There are a couple caveats. You need a listener. It's not optional in this case. Although it's the listener is one of the benefits, not everybody configures one. A listener is absolutely required here. Another thing which I'll show you is that this is purely all done in SQL Server. You won't see any traces of this in the Windows Server failover cluster. Although it's not apparent from this diagram, in this case where I have AG1 and that has my primary database, then that's my read-write copy. Everything else is essentially in a loading state. You don't have, this is not scale out, this is not rack, you don't have two writable copies of the database. And seeding also works with this. So again, this is all stuff I've tested. So let me switch over to this, not that one. Give me 1 second. I shut the wrong thing. So in the meantime, while I'm getting this up, John, if we have any questions, I'm able to take one or two.
I do actually have a couple questions for you. First one is DTC supported for databases in different AGs but in the same SQL instance?
I haven't tested that. In theory, it should work. But again, as long as the database is external to the AG, it should work. But again, it's not something I've tested.
Okay. And the other question is there a limit on the number of AGs using basic availability groups on standard edition?
No, it's just like database mirroring. You can have any number of pairs. You'll be limited by resources, meaning threads and CPUs and all the standard stuff we have now. But think of this as database mirroring in AG form. I just need to wait for this stuff to come up, so give me a second here. It was loaded earlier. I know why it's shutting down, but the joys of demo, right? But yeah, hopefully that answers your question. If it doesn't, let me know.
If you've got time, we have two more questions that just came in.
Sure.
How about seeding over a multi-subnet cluster?
I tested it. It works fine. Won't have any issues with that. Obviously, network throughput, and you're bound by that, but it just goes over networking. So as long as basically your endpoints can talk, you won't have any issues.
Okay. And the last one we have right now, can we have databases in an availability group span different failover cluster instances?
Can you clarify that question?
He says, like we were able to do with mirroring, also the ability to mirror using certificates.
We'll talk about certificate scenario in a minute, but can you read the original question again? Because like we did with database mirroring didn't clarify it for me.
Okay. I think what he's asking is, do you have to have, do all of the replicas in an availability group for basic availability groups, I'm sorry, not for basic, do all of the replicas in an availability group have to be on the same failover cluster instance?
Well, all your primaries in an availability group, so for a given availability group, all your primary databases have to be in the same. That's always been the case. That will always be the case. You can't have, say, an availability group where, say, on instance A and the replicas on B where your primary databases are mixed. So that will never be possible.
Okay. Thank you. That's all we have for now.
Okay. just in time for a demo here. So, what I've got here, and I will show you in a second. This, I haven't had a chance to update this. This was actually what I did for a lab scenario that I did for SQL Nexus a few months back, which is why I actually shut down, because it's a timed out thing. But that's okay. So let me connect here. There we go. I'm going to show you a little bit of what happens with seeding, and then also what a distributed availability group kind of looks like. And of course, didn't save my one query. Again, it is what it is. Okay. So when I have seeding, basically, here's what you do. You set seeding mode to automatic. Now, I just created this about an hour ago. So if there are ways you can monitor this, but to easily show you where it stands, hold on a second. Let me try and make this bigger so I can see this. Give me a second. All right. So find grant. Okay. So what you'll see here in the log file is this message that basically says, once I join the availability group on the secondary, hey, I notice you've done seeding mode of automatic, but you need to give me permissions to do so. So in addition to joining it, this sort of the secret sauce behind seeding is this alter availability group grant create any database thing. And once that happens, what we'll see is basically it will go out and actually create the database files. Now obviously this assumes you have to have the same structure. And here you go. It's going to create everything and sync it up. And again, you'll see all this in the SQL Server log. There are other ways to monitor this. But I wanted to show you that seeding is a real thing, and it's actually really powerful. Now, what I also have here is this. So I've got an availability group. Let me go here. And you notice here I've got this distributed availability group, or dist AG. Okay? Now, if I do a new query, so select star from availability groups, you'll see that if I look under dist AG, which is the second line here, there's a brand new column called is distributed. Now, if I go out to my Windows failover cluster, I see the other two AGs, but I don't see the distributed availability group. This is part of what I was talking about. It's purely a SQL Server convention. And that is me running all my demos and it barking at me. So what this is all maintained by SQL Server. So if I now look at sys availability replicas, so if I look at, excuse me, lab node 1, node 2, where AR sys, AR dot endpoint URL Sorry about that. And they did the old never type live, but hey, it is what it is, right? Where AG dot buddy equals AR dot buddy. So you'll notice here a couple of things. So this one, right, actually let me do, so AG dot name. All right, that's a little better. So in my distributed availability group, notice that it says AG1 and AG2. It doesn't say the underlying node names. Also note that the endpoint URL are my listener names. They're not the underlying node names. So I'm going to go into more detail on this in my half-day talk, but consider this kind of an introduction. Here, so you saw that there's an is distributed column in the sys availability groups, but also the fact that the endpoints are using this right here, and we've got this over here. Now, if I connect to this over here, we will notice that over on the Always On High Availability tab, again, I've got my distributed availability group, and if I look at my replicas again, AG1, AG2, and this is currently the secondary. So again, just a little, shall we say, teaser for distributed availability groups, because I have to have other stuff to show. This is a very cool feature. It's something I think a lot of people long-term will be able to take advantage of. I haven't tried to configure this with basic availability groups, but I don't think it's possible. I think this is pretty much, given the nature of how it works, an enterprise feature, although it's probably not called out as such. Again, I put an asterisk next to that because I can't say 100% for sure because I haven't tested it. And there's no documentation that explicitly says that I've seen or worded that way. So what's new in Windows? So first of all, we've got two new storage deployments stuff, ways that we can deploy FCIs. First thing is storage replica, which I really don't have time to demo, unfortunately, although that's how I got these screenshots. Basically, think of storage replica as it is block level replication. So if you have currently a proprietary hardware-based solution, if this is purely for clustered instances and clustered stuff only, this can't work outside the context of that. If you're using Windows Server 2016, you can now do it built in. So if you wanted to create a geographically dispersed FCI, you can do this with Windows Server 2016 as well as storage replica. Now, it was actually just announced today, so good timing for this presentation, that Windows Server 2016 is officially essentially RTMing at Ignite, or by the time of Ignite, which I sort of figured, which is at the end of September here in the US. So basically, we're not far off from Windows Server 2016. Now, the reason I put these two screenshots is the first one there, which I'll zoom in on. To make this work with SQL Server, if you're setting it up via the GUI, you have to set up as write ordering, so that obviously with SQL Server, writes out of order would be very bad. And secondly, this second one over here basically shows it working. Now, how it works is pretty simple. You have your source data disk, you've got your destination data disk, and each of those essentially has a log file. So think of it as a 1:3 ratio, meaning for every one data disk you have, or log in this case for SQL Server, you have 3 other disks. And by log here I mean replication log for storage replica, not SQL Server logs or T-logs. So this is why I put this in this deployment deck, because it changes how you, what, say, disks you need, what you're going to have to carve up. It's a very cool feature, works very well. It also changes, to be honest with you, how you right now deploy your FCIs, or the order that you deploy things in. I have some emails going back and forth with both SQL Dev and Windows Dev on this right now. I'm hoping that experience may improve, but I'm not going to hold my breath. Excuse me. And the other one is called Storage Spaces Direct. So outside of a local temp DB, if you have the right hardware to do that, another way that's changed from a storage perspective is something called Storage Spaces Direct, which I won't be demoing for you here today. Basically, is we can basically aggregate local storage, present it up as clustered storage, and use it for things like FCIs. So it's basically the combination of Windows clustering plus storage spaces to make this work. They're targeting things like super high and fast flash stuff like NVMe. If you're not familiar with that, I looked that term up. So this is, I believe, Storage Spaces Direct, whose acronym is S2D. I believe it's a data center only feature. But for those who are going to need something like this is going to be a great deployment option. Because this data center might put it out of contention for some, and if possible, this is something I hope to demo at PASS Summit, assuming everything being equal. Neither of these scenarios is for AGs. They're targeted for FCIs. And the big one after this, I believe this is it. Yep. The big one after this, because I want to show a demo, I wanted to make sure I had time to get to this demo, is deploying Windows clusters without Active Directory. Currently, this is, again, Windows Server 2016, and obviously later, only. So if you're currently only deploying Windows Server 2012 R2 and earlier, this will not be an option. Don't think about it. Don't ask for it. You're not getting it backported. The genesis of this actually started with Windows Server 2012. There's a concept, if you look up, called AD detached clusters, or Windows Server failover clusters. And the problem there is that the nodes themselves still needed to be domain joined. Well, with Windows Server 2016, they basically completed the work in that you can now have a detached, and basically meaning you're using DNS as your naming and IP stuff from record. There's no hooks into Active Directory and all that stuff. So for the question that got asked earlier, assuming you're going to use Windows Server 2016 and SQL Server 2016, that's the other rub here. This will not be supported for any versions earlier than SQL Server 2016. You can basically have that database mirroring with certificate scenario. That is how I actually set up that distributed availability group. And now I've set up a few other demos. Unfortunately, I did have a blog post that sort of got eaten a few months ago that I probably revisit, but right now my focus is on finishing the book, and this kind of stuff will be in there. Some caveats here, though. If you still need Kerberos, you're going to need Active Directory, so this will not be an option for you. I do have an older blog post when this was first announced, which covers some of this, so that link is there. Now let me demo this for you just a little bit. So let me make this bigger. View full screen. All right. So a couple things I'm going to show you here. First thing is, notice here I've got an AG here that, pretty standard stuff. If I look here at my node, this is Windows Server 2016 Technical Preview 5. However, note the difference here. This is where I got the screenshot earlier. I've got a 2-node SQL Server Standard. And notice there also is HADR enabled as true. So again, just showing you that in Standard we can do availability groups. However, if I go look at this node, note that I'm connected as it's a work group. It is not domain joined. Now, you'll notice that the full computer name is tp5node1.sqlha.com. A big part of what makes this work is that you have to have your DNS suffix. So if you don't get DNS suffix right, this isn't going to work. So DNS is your linchpin in creating a cluster that has no domain. Now, in the earlier technical previews of Windows, this is how you needed to do things. So would have been easier typing it. Okay, so you'll see I've got this. If I do get cluster node, move this up a little bit. I've got two clusters, two nodes as part of this. Both are up. This is my cluster. Here are all my roles or resource groups in the cluster. I just have this AG1, which maps to, not surprisingly, my availability group over here. And in that, I've got a listener. And notice here that it's multi-subnet. So think of this as your database mirroring, where I had my principal in site A, my DR or my mirror in site B, and I'm in a multi-subnet scenario. But again, I've also got the listener to broker this, which means the listener can work in both subnets. All right? Now, as of, it was either technical preview 3 or 4, you had the ability to administer but not create a non-domain joined cluster and failover cluster manager. In the earlier technical previews, you did not have the ability to do this. So awesome. Here, so what I've implemented here is a domainless Windows Server 2016 failover cluster with a SQL Server 2016 standard edition availability group spanning multiple subnets. And this is what basically we've got with database mirroring today with certificates. Very cool. All enabled by all the new stuff Microsoft is giving us in these new versions of Windows and SQL Server. So if you haven't started playing Windows Server 2016, I highly suggest that you start looking at it, especially if this is a scenario you want to have. So to summarize, because we're almost at the hour and I'll leave a couple minutes for questions, there are lots of changes in Windows and SQL. And again, I focused in this talk just on a lot of the deployment stuff you'll need for planning or things you'll need to do at install time, or configuration time of your AG, not so much some of the behavioral stuff or quorum changes or upgrade stuff. That will come in my half-day talk at Summit. I'm also going to do a little bit of that in my talk in Chicago next month as well, which we'll see in a second. I really highly suggest evaluating the combination of SQL Server 2016, Windows Server 2016. They're both going to be a pretty formidable combination. I mentioned some of those trace flags. Please test them in a non-production environment under load. Don't enable them and say, well, Allan said to do this. It was going to make my network stuff better, but it killed my processor. Always test this stuff. And like I mentioned, I didn't cover all the new stuff for availability in this talk. Just come see me at another time. You'll get some of that stuff. So if you want to know more, I have a class coming up in Chicago next month. A few seats, limited or availability. I'm supporting WIT, so Women in Technology. So we are giving away a seat for WIT. So if you're female, go to that blog post. You have until Friday, the 15th of this month, July, to enter with your entry, and we will pick a winner by Monday. I'm speaking to Chicago SQL Server User Group next month, covering more what's new in SQL Server 2016 and Windows 2016 for availability, so basically an expanded talk of this. At Past Summit, I'm doing a pre-con, which is on troubleshooting. So I noticed that the VC will have a precursor a couple weeks before. As part of mine, you'll also have a hands-on lab, so it's a full day of troubleshooting goodness. And then finally, I'll be doing an expanded version of this with everything, plus much more demo at Past Summit. And so it's a half-day deep dive on all the new availability stuff in SQL Server and Windows Server 2016. And with that, let's open up the floor to questions. Take it away, John.
Okay, we've got just a couple more here that have come in. One is, what would be the use cases for allowing the cluster to work without Active Directory?
So basically, there are a lot of people who feel, well, first of all, there are a lot of people that don't like clustering. But there are other people who basically want to, say, have that database mirroring scenario. There are a lot of customers who don't have Active Directory elsewhere, but they want to, say, get up an availability group. This will allow them to do that, assuming they don't need Kerberos. Now, one thing I didn't mention, but it was on the slide, it's currently only for AGs. Maybe they'll support it for FCIs, I don't know. Right now that is not the case, and there's some other stuff that would need to be changed for that to work, I believe. I tested some of that, but the reality is it's for people who don't have a lot of Active Directory, want that database mirroring with certificate scenario, which is more people than you probably think. It does change the way you need to think about things like quorum in your cluster, but again, that's something out of scope of talk for this talk.
Okay. And the last question in the queue is, can you use S2D and SQL on the same cluster, or must the S2D be configured on different servers?
Well, S2D is essentially, it's basically a cluster in a box. It is actually the same nodes. Because again, I didn't go into it fully here, but basically presenting that storage up locally, aggregating your storage, and then your FCIs can see it. So it is all local. It's not like scale-out file server where you have your high bandwidth stuff sitting on other servers, and you're using high-speed networking and SMB, or SMB Direct in this case, with RDMA to connect through SOFS. Basically, you're taking all that, compressing it down into your cluster nodes. That's essentially what S2D is.
Okay. That's all the questions in the queue.
So, hey, Allan, if we had time, I had one more to throw at you.
Sure.
When you went over the setting up the AG-less Windows failover cluster, does that have to use DNS, or is there any possibility to pull that off with just using like a host file without DNS?
I don't think it's supported without that.
Okay.
While it may work, I would not do that. As far as I know, DNS is a secret sauce, but again, it's all a trade-off. If you don't want the domain, you have to have something.
Yep.
So, in most environments, they have DNS, so that's generally not an issue.
Yep, no, agreed. I was just kind of curious. Have you had a chance to test or know if this works both with like FCIs and AGs? Or
Well, like I just said, it's only supported with the AGs at the moment.
Okay.
In theory, because you could present shared storage to two servers through zoning and masking, let's say at your SAM level, and not have it be domain joined, in theory this could work with FCIs, but there's other stuff that in SQL Server setup I think that would fundamentally have to change. So out of the box, there's pretty much no way for it to support FCIs now. Maybe they will in the future, maybe in the future version of SQL, or maybe never. But the target scenario really was AGs, because people want to basically have database mirroring with all the advanced functionality of AGs. So now we basically have that in the combo of Windows Server 2016, SQL Server 2016.
Cool. Thank you, sir. All right. Yep, I think that's it. Don't see any new questions added. So thank you, everyone, for attending. We look forward to seeing you next month. I'm going to go ahead here and stop the recording and close out the meeting. Allan, thanks you again for presenting for us. We greatly appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. And have a great afternoon, everyone.